June 6, 1944 marks one of the most pivotal moments in modern history. On this day, Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, cracking the Atlantic wall of Hitler's fortress Europe, thus announcing the beginning of the end of World War II in Europe. Just 9 days later, while the world's attention remained fixed on the fighting alongside the Normandy coast, another D-Day was unfolding thousands of miles away on the opposite side of the globe. This invasion, though less grand in scale, was no less significant. On the shores of a small island in the Pacific Ocean, American Marines and soldiers faced an enemy more relentless and fanatical than those in Europe. This was the Battle of Saipan, a ferocious encounter that would become one of the bloodiest chapters in American military history and the beginning of the end for the Empire of Japan. In late 1942, it was already evident that the tides of war had changed and that the United States was in a good position to defeat Japan in the war. Yet at that moment, the Empire of the Sun was still far from defeated, and the American Joint Chiefs of Staff had a lot to do to make it through. The first step in this effort was to devise a strategy for approaching Japan, a matter that caused some intense debate among American military leaders. There were two key opinions devised by Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, and General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area. The problem was, King and MacArthur had diametrically opposed opinions on the best strategy to defeat Japan. King wanted to attack through the Central Pacific, while MacArthur preferred a land route through New Guinea to the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, one of the most famous American military commanders, wanted to retake the Philippines, which he had lost early in the war. He argued that attacking through New Guinea was the best way to defeat Japan. MacArthur was determined to make his plan come through and often clashed with others to get the resources he needed for his plan. He also had strong personal reasons for wanting to return to the Philippines, from which he was forced to escape in the spring of 1942. Admiral King, on the other hand, believed a Central Pacific route was a better option. He thought capturing islands such as the Marianas would cut off Japan's supply lines and provide bases from which the newly introduced B-29 bombers could bomb industrial installations in Japan. He too was determined and willing to fight for his strategy, even against strong opposition. This matter was discussed at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. In the end, the Allies decided to advance on both fronts. King's plan was finally approved in early 1944. The Joint Chiefs decided to bypass the Carolines and target the Marianas directly, setting the stage for Operation Forager. The goal of Operation Forager was to capture the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and later the Palau Islands of Peleliu and Anguar. In charge of the overall plan was Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He appointed Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, the seasoned commander of the Fifth Fleet, as the commander of the American forces attacking Saipan. Vice Admiral Richmond Turner was put in charge of the overall organization of the landing on Saipan, and once American troops landed on Saipan, their ground operations would be led by Lieutenant General Holland Smith of the United States Marine Corps. The main units involved were the 2nd Marine Division and the 4th Marine Division, supported by the Army's 27th Infantry Division, which was supposed to act as a reserve. In total, these three units numbered around 60,000 men. The naval support was crucial for the operation. For this purpose, the 5th Fleet organized Task Force 58, a formidable naval force organized into 5 separate task groups. Each group was built around 1 or 2 fleet carriers and included a mix of battleships, cruisers, light carriers, and destroyers to provide comprehensive protection and support. The fleet carried around 900 aircraft, including the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers. Opposite to them were Japanese forces under the overall command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of the 43rd Infantry Division stationed at Saipan. Apart from this division, there were also troops of the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, 9th Tank Regiment, 136th Infantry Regiment, and other support and artillery units. In addition, the Japanese had around 400 aircraft stationed on the island. These planes included a mix of fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. American war planners estimated that Japanese forces on Saipan numbered no more than 18,000 soldiers. In reality, the island was defended by 32,000 soldiers, all of them determined to fight to the death. The Japanese plan was to organize the defense in depth of the island, starting from the beaches and reaching the center of the island in the caves of Mount Tapachao. Luckily for the Americans, most of the installations were not finished by the time of the assault. American forces training took place in Hawaii. Both the Marines and the Army worked hard to prepare for the difficult battle ahead. They practiced amphibious landings, jungle warfare, and coordination with naval and air support. Unfortunately, soldiers and Marines trained separately and did not coordinate their battle plans. It was a terrible mistake that would cost them dearly during the campaign. On the morning of June 15, 1944, the Marines and soldiers were ready. They had an early breakfast, collected their equipment, and prepared for the assault. The initial plan was to land 20,000 troops on the southwestern coast of the island in the vicinity of the town called Charan Kanoa. The 2nd Marine Division was to land on the red and green beaches north of the town, while the 4th Marine Division aimed for blue and yellow beaches to the south. The first-day objective was to secure the beaches and move inland, capturing key positions from which the troops would cut off the southern part of the island and an important Aslito airfield. The landing phase was preceded by a devastating preparatory attack of Task Force 58. On June 11, 1944, over 200 F-6F Hellcats launched a surprise attack on Japanese airfields in Saipan and Tinian, disabling about 130 Japanese aircraft. The attack incapacitated most of the 1st Air Fleet's land-based planes, thus providing the Americans air superiority over Saipan. For the next 4 days, the task force continued to harass airfields, bomb military targets, and burn cane fields on southern Saipan, reducing the 1st Air Fleet to around 100 aircraft by week's end. On June 13th, 7 fast battleships and 11 destroyers joined the effort and began shelling Saipan, weakening the defense of the towns of Garapan and Charan Kanoa, but failing to destroy island defenses. On June 14th, 7 older battleships, 11 cruisers, and 26 destroyers continued the shelling, eliminating many anti-aircraft positions but still not destroying most beach defenses. Finally, on June 15th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Saipan. The 2nd Marine Division was met with intense Japanese fire as they approached the shore. Many of their amphibious tractors were hit, forcing the Marines to jump out and wade through the water under fire. The situation became a bit chaotic as landing areas became crowded because some units were pushed off course by enemy fire. This made them easy targets for Japanese artillery and mortars. However, despite these difficulties, the Marines secured the beach and started to move inland. The 4th Marine Division landed with less crowding but still faced heavy fire. Their Amtraks made it through the reef and reached the beach. The Marines quickly moved to take their first objective, a 2-mile distant Aslito airfield. After securing the airfield, they needed to cross the island to the east coast. This would split the island and isolate the Japanese forces in the south. On June 16th, General Holland Smith reinforced the beachhead at Saipan by ordering 2 regiments of the 27th Infantry Division to land. That night, General Saito launched a tank assault with about 30 tanks and 1,000 soldiers. A poorly coordinated attack was repelled by U.S. forces. The 2nd Marine Division continued its move inland and north toward Garapan and Mount Tapachao, while the 4th Marine Division advanced on Aslito Field. On June 18th, the 27th Infantry Division helped them capture the airfield, forcing the Japanese to withdraw to Nafutan Point in the southeastern corner of the island. The 4th Marine Division reached the eastern coast and moved north following the coastline. By June 19th, Japanese forces on Saipan had been halved, and Saito withdrew to a central defensive line. The Americans had suffered over 6,000 casualties. The following day, the last regiment of the 27th Infantry Division landed on the island. All 3 divisions approached the slopes of Mount Tapachao, where they were to experience the most challenging fighting of the campaign. As the battle on the island intensified, a fierce clash was also brewing at sea. Once Admiral Soimu Toyota, commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, confirmed Saipan as the invasion target, he initiated Operation Ago, aiming to destroy the American fleet. Initially, the Japanese Navy planned the battle in the Palaus or Western Carolines. However, after the pre-invasion bombardment of Saipan, Toyota ordered Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki to rendezvous with Vice Admiral Giosburo Ozawa in the Philippine Sea to attack the American fleet around Saipan. The Japanese fleet, with 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, and nearly 500 airplanes, was by far outnumbered by the American fleet, but they believed they had advantages with longer-range planes and Marianas air bases for quick rearming. They also had an incorrect assumption of having 500 additional land-based planes, not knowing that the Americans had already destroyed most of these aircraft. The U.S. fleet was ready for the Japanese attack. Apart from having more aircraft carriers and better planes, they also had superior radar technology, which gave them a significant advantage in locating Japanese flying formations. On June 19, 1944, the Japanese launched their first wave of attacks. They sent hundreds of planes to attack the U.S. fleet. However, using their radars, the Americans detected the incoming planes early and sent their fighters to intercept them. The American pilots, flying better planes like the F-6F Hellcat, quickly engaged the Japanese. The result was devastating for the Japanese. Many of their planes were shot down before they could even reach the U.S. fleet. The U.S. pilots shot down hundreds of Japanese planes in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost nearly 400 planes, while the Americans only lost about 30. The Japanese tried several more attacks, but each one ended in the same way. The Japanese pilots, many of whom were inexperienced, stood little chance against the well-trained American pilots and anti-aircraft gunners. As the day continued, the Japanese fleet tried to move closer to the U.S. ships to launch a more effective attack. However, the U.S. fleet moved to avoid them, keeping a safe distance while continuing to use their superior air power. The poor coordination and communication made the Japanese fleet attacks even less effective. On June 20th, the U.S. fleet took the initiative. After spending half a day locating the Japanese fleet, Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher, in command of the Task Force 58, ordered a large airstrike against the retreating Japanese fleet. Despite being at the limit of the strike range, American air fleet managed to sink several ships, including the carrier Haya, and damaged many others. The Japanese fleet was forced to retreat further, and the battle was effectively over. The Battle of Philippine Sea was a decisive victory for the United States. The Japanese Navy lost 3 aircraft carriers, over 600 planes, and many experienced pilots. This loss crippled the Japanese carrier air forces, which they never fully recovered from. Back on Saipan, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions faced fierce resistance as they advanced inland on Saipan. The 2nd Marine Division moved up the west coast, aiming to take Garapan, the island's capital. The Marines fought through dense jungles on the slopes of Mount Tapachao, dotted with entrenched caves and hilltops, which the Japanese effectively used to their advantage. The Marines had to clear each of these caves and hills, often using flamethrowers and grenades. The Japanese fought fiercely, making the Marines work hard for every yard they gained. Despite these challenges, the 2nd Marine Division made steady progress. They reached the highest peaks on the island, Mount Tapachao and Mount Tipopale. Securing these peaks was crucial because the Japanese used them to target Marines on the beaches. Meanwhile, the 4th Marine Division moved north along the east coast. They had to move through the sugarcane fields that provided cover for Japanese snipers. The Marines used artillery and air support to clear these fields. The 4th Marine Division's progress was slow but steady. They managed to secure key positions and push the Japanese further north. Yet the biggest challenge was faced by the 27th Infantry Division, which advanced between the Marines divisions along a narrow, rocky valley with steep hills on both sides, which the Japanese used to their advantage by placing machine guns, mortars, and snipers in well-hidden positions. Because they had to move through this narrow valley while under constant fire, the soldiers of the 27th Infantry Division named it the Death Valley. The first to advance into Death Valley was the 105th Infantry Regiment. As they moved in on June 23rd, they were met with fierce resistance from the Japanese. The soldiers had to fight their way through dense vegetation and rocky terrain. The fighting was aggravated by the fact that the Japanese were well hidden in caves and bunkers, making it difficult to spot them. The fighting was intense and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The Japanese were determined to hold their ground. They would wait until the American soldiers were close before opening fire. This made every advance dangerous and slow. The soldiers had to be constantly alert, ready to respond to sudden attacks. The 106th Infantry Regiment was brought in to support the 105th. They moved into the valley facing the same intense resistance. The two regiments worked together, using coordinated attacks to try to clear the Japanese positions. The soldiers had to move from one rocky outcrop to another, often under heavy fire. To clear the Japanese positions, the soldiers used flamethrowers and grenades. These weapons were effective in the close quarters of the valley. The soldiers would throw grenades into caves and bunkers, then use flamethrowers to clear any remaining resistance. This method was dangerous, but very often the only way to deal with the well-entrenched Japanese. The fighting in Death Valley continued for several days. The soldiers of the 27th Infantry Division faced constant fire and frequent counterattacks. They showed incredible bravery and determination, pushing forward despite the difficult conditions. As the soldiers advanced, they began to gain ground. They managed to clear several key Japanese positions, including the notorious Purple Heart Ridge, slowly pushing the enemy back. The use of artillery and air support helped to weaken the Japanese defenses, allowing the soldiers to make progress. By June 30th, they managed to eliminate all Japanese pockets of resistance in Death Valley, ending one, if not the most intense fighting of the Battle of Saipan. Once the 27th Infantry Division passed Death Valley and reconnected with the Marines on its flanks, they could focus on eliminating the remaining Japanese forces in northern Saipan. The 2nd Marine Division moved along the western coast, securing key positions and pushing the Japanese further north. They encountered strong defenses but continued to advance. The Marines had to engage in house-to-house fighting in some areas, especially around Garapan, the island's capital. Another critical area was Tanapag Harbor, which the Japanese decided to defend fiercely because of its strategic importance. The joint American forces comprising the units from the 4th Marines Division and the 27th Infantry Division launched a series of assaults on the harbor, using tanks, artillery, and infantry. The fighting was intense, but the Americans eventually broke through, securing the harbor and cutting off a major escape route for the Japanese. The 4th Marine Division advanced along the eastern coast. They faced similar challenges, with the Japanese entrenched in caves and fortified positions. The Marines used artillery and air support to help dislodge the enemy. Despite the tough resistance, they managed to make steady progress. As American forces continued to push north, the Japanese resistance became more desperate. The enemy soldiers fought with determination to the last, making the final phase of the battle particularly bloody. In the final days of the Battle of Saipan, the Japanese launched the famous Jikusai attack. Jin in Japanese, Jikusai stands for honorable suicide, and it was a final banzai charge by thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians. Knowing that defeat was inevitable, they chose to die fighting rather than surrender. On the night of July 6th through the 7th, the Japanese prepared for their last stand. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, the Japanese commander, gathered all remaining troops and ordered them to attack the American lines. The soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and low on ammunition, but they were determined to follow their orders. Many civilians, including women and children, joined the soldiers, carrying weapons or simply following to show their support. As dawn approached, the Japanese forces began their charge. 3,000 soldiers and civilians moved toward the American positions in a large human wave. They were shouting and screaming, trying to overwhelm the American troops through sheer numbers and ferocity. The attack was chaotic and brutal. The Japanese used whatever weapons they had left, including rifles, grenades, swords, and even bamboo spears. The American soldiers were caught off guard by the intensity of the charge. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of the attack. The Japanese forces broke through the American lines in several places, creating confusion and panic. Despite the surprise and the ferocity of the attack, the Americans quickly regrouped. They used machine guns, rifles, and artillery to repel the Japanese. The battle lasted for several hours, with the Japanese continuing to charge even as their numbers dwindled. By the end of the attack, the battlefield was littered with bodies, and the American soldiers were stunned by the scale of the sacrifice. Yet this was not the end. Following the WWII attack, many Japanese soldiers and civilians who had survived retreated to the northern cliffs of Saipan. These cliffs, later known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, became sites of mass suicides. The Japanese believed that surrendering to the Americans would bring shame and dishonor to their families, so they chose death over capture. Hundreds of soldiers and civilians, including women and children, jumped from the cliffs into the sea or onto the rocks below. Some families leaped together, holding hands. Others threw their children off before jumping themselves. The scenes were tragic and heartbreaking. American soldiers tried to stop the suicides by shouting and using loudspeakers, but their efforts were mostly in vain. Mass suicides were a devastating end to the Battle of Saipan. The American soldiers were deeply affected by what they witnessed. The brutality and the scale of the suicides left a lasting impression on everyone involved. The cliffs became a symbol of the extreme measures the Japanese were willing to take in the face of defeat. Around 1,000 civilians who jumped to death at the Suicide Cliff were the last of the 10,000 inhabitants of the Saipan who lost their lives during the 24 days of the battle. As for the Japanese garrison that defended the island, almost none of the soldiers survived. Only 800 of them suffered the disgrace of being taken prisoner. American casualties were also tremendous. 16,500 men, of which 3,200 were killed and 13,000 were wounded. The casualty rate for American forces was over 20%, which was comparable to Tarawa, by that time the bloodiest battle of the Pacific theater of war. Yet the success they achieved by seizing Saipan was immeasurably significant. The victory spurred the morale of the American troops and the belief that they might win the war. More importantly, the United States had gained an airfield from which its B-29 bombers were able to fly to Japan and attack their industrial centers. At the same time, the loss of Saipan was a significant blow for the Japanese military leaders, who for the first time had to acknowledge to their people that the war was not going in their favor. Indeed, they were right, as the Battle of Saipan was only the first hop toward the total defeat of the Empire of the Rising Sun. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Stay tuned.